All right, well, welcome to Beyond the Youth Room podcast. This episode is going to be all about leaders modeling what they want their students to do and to be in the ministry. And so we're going to be talking about that today. Today's episode is sponsored by Edge Clubs. We have a free training manual for you guys to take the guesswork out of student missionaries reaching their public schools for Christ. We start Edge Clubs all around our area, but if you can benefit from, if you're out of the Northern Virginia or the DMV area, you can still benefit from this by just downloading a free training manual, and you can take a look on how we use this process to launch Edge Clubs and to train students to be missionaries to their schools. So go to edgeclub.org for that. Now, in today's podcast, we're going to be talking, as I mentioned, about leaders modeling it. And one of the challenging aspects of that is the accountability involved with that, right? Like if we're going to be ones that lead by examples, we have to up our own game. Personally, we have to recruit leaders that are living it out, that are not just hypocrites that are just coming here and teach the students, but not actually doing it. Mm-hmm. And one of the big things in our ministry we've seen is really when we see students that are seeing examples of how to live that out. It really does impact their own personal way of walking, like in their faith, how they're sharing the gospel. I can't remember the exact percentage. I know it was in the 80s. I was trying to find this stat before, but I couldn't. But I heard once that over 80% of students that share the gospel saw an adult do it first. Mm-hmm. And so with that being said, tell us a little about your personal experience, because we were talking about this before we started recording, about how a leader leading by example mm-hmm. in your own life has impacted your own ministry.
Yeah, so I have the unique privilege of growing up in the church that I now serve at on staff. And so we started coming to this church in 2000. So I met my wife here. I met all my best friends here. And then God, opened the door to come back on staff. And so I had the privilege of growing up in our youth group. And it was actually I had a youth pastor who was investing in us, but really I had a youth leader, a volunteer youth leader who was investing in me and some of my classmates in my grade. And he's Mr. Utney, and he's still Mr. Utney to me, but he's actually an elder at our church. And so whenever I host and I have to call him by his first name, I cringe a little bit inside. But he really invested in us. He taught us scripture, and he was faithful and coming to youth group. But really, he invested in us in every area. I mean, he took us on. We went on a rafting trip. We went on a high ropes trip. And he really built into us what it meant to be a man of God. And so growing up, I had I was so blessed to have my own dad who was doing that. But now I had, a youth leader who was also modeling it. So now I had two men living this out for me of what it looked like. Yeah. And so he is still one of, on my Mount Rushmore of spiritual, influences in my life today, along with, my dad and my parents, of course. And, he's still a person I go to today when I, have a question or things like that. And because of that, too, he also created a group of us where his son was the best man in my wedding. And we were all in another buddy's wedding. And, so it's just really, really cool to see that, his spiritual family tree, so to speak, included all of us because he was willing to faithfully, pour into us and model what it looked like to follow Christ.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and even think about my own walk with the Lord as coming to Christ as a teenager. It was funny because I was just talking to my wife about this, that it seemed like all the themes of people that impacted me early on, they had a J name. So one of my good friends that discipled me, he was a ninth grader. I was an eighth grader when we first started a discipleship relationship. His name was Jordan. And then one of my main youth leaders was Joel. And then I had friends named Jerry, Jeff, and Josh. And it was kind of ironic that and I don't even think I remember thinking about how ironic that was, that everybody that was impacting me was named Jeff or Jay, had a J name. But one of the things I saw, even as a student leader, that there was another exemplary student leader that I kind of walked in his path, was my friend Jordan, which I think I've shared this story before, but with you, when it comes to just really seeing the gospel lived out in high school, Jordan was like the example of that. And so when he found out that I was a believer, that I became a Christian, he called me up, and I was 8th grade. He was 9th grade. He's like, "Hey, I heard you became a Christian. You want me to disciple you?" And I was like, "Sure. What is that?" And then he's like, "I don't really know. I'm trying to figure this out too." He's like, "Why don't you come over to my house every Monday and we'll read the Bible together. We'll ask each other for, sharing our faith. We'll, answer any questions that we have." And he's like, and if we get in trouble or like we don't know where to go from here, we'll ask my dad, he's a pastor. And so it was through that relationship that I developed with him that I saw an example of how to walk with Christ. And I think that's the second part of discipleship, right? So we go make disciples and then teach to obey. Like we teach them to obey the things that we know.
Yeah.
And so Jordan was the type that lived out his faith. I mean, he was like, he was a running back for our football team. I was a second string lineman. So like I didn't have as much influence. He was like our team captain. And during his senior year, I was a junior. He came to me that summer before and he's like, hey, I'm not sure if I'm going to play football. I was like, what do you mean? Like you're like, God told me you're going to play football. Like, and he's like, well, like, I'm just, I'm unsure if the Lord really wants me to or not. We're like, our team needs you. Like, yes, he does. And so, but I was like, I'll pray for you. So, so we prayed and then he came back. He's like, yeah, I think I'm going to, play football this year, but for the sole purpose of sharing the gospel with everybody on the football team. Will you help me do it? And I was like, yeah, I'm all in. Like, I don't have anything to lose. Like, and so that season, he stood up on the locker room like right before our first game, and it was like, "Hey, some of you guys know that I wasn't going to be playing football this year, but I decided to play for this very moment." And he just shares the gospel, gives an invitation, and like a whole bunch of our teammates gave their life to Christ right then and there. And then we spent the rest of the season plugging them in the churches and discipling them. And so I saw that like firsthand, an example of what that looks like. And so I think in some ways, like I'm still bold in my faith today because of that example that I had as just another student. So when we're talking about leaders, we're not just talking about adult leaders, right? We can see student leaders that are leading by example for other students as well.
Yeah.
Another, as I mentioned, my youth leader, Joel, who was the pastor's son at the church that I started getting plugged into, we just hung out a lot. So I got to see how he interacted with people. I saw the good, bad, and the ugly. Like he was a fairly, he had given his life to Christ before, but then he had like walked away from the faith and really came back as, he was like a college-age student. And gave his life to Christ, just was all in and just very vocal about his faith, like just sharing the gospel with everybody. And I saw that firsthand as an example. I saw that, and I learned how to read my Bible, and I learned how to defend certain doctrines of the faith, mainly through Joel and through my friend Jordan. So when it came to these examples, they impacted me personally. It sounds like for you as well. But how can we create that culture within our youth ministries where we're having leaders that are leading by example? So one, how do we recruit those types of leaders? Like we want those types of people in our ministry. Yeah. But we might be, handed down leaders that have been there forever. We might have parents in our ministry that don't really, get your vision for youth ministry yet. What are some things that we can do to help cultivate that type of example in leaders in our ministry?
Well, first, if leaders fully embrace and model it, then we must embrace and model it. And so I like to use the analogy of, you go to a gym and, you're looking for a personal trainer, and the guy that walks up looks like he hasn't worked out, ever. You're probably not going to pick that person as to be your personal trainer. And so if somebody, if we're trying to recruit godly people who really want to invest in the next generation, then we ourselves must look like that. You replicate what you are. And so I think first it's taking a step back and saying, okay, am I modeling this? Would somebody look at me and say, yeah, they're the ones doing this? And so as Paul says, follow me as I follow Christ. The second thing I would say is never recruit out of desperation. Never, act out of desperation, because it never ends well. Yep. And so I like to say I'd rather be understaffed with the right people than fully staffed with the wrong people. Because when you have to take your focus off of students and start dealing with problems at the leader level, then the kids lose out, and it's almost worse. It is worse. It's worse than not having a leader there, because now you're dealing with problems and they see that, and it can be really, really messy. So never recruit out of desperation. And then this is going to sound kind of creepy, but like watch people. Like like I said, there's no way to say that. But
like through their windows, or like, what do you mean? Like watch people? Like,
I have never brought on a volunteer that I haven't watched for 6 months. And I literally tell them, I'm like, hey, like this is kind of weird, but like I've been praying about you being a volunteer. I mean, and talk about a great conversation with the volunteers. Like, hey, I've been praying for the past year that you would come on board and be a leader in student ministry. Okay, like yeah, I guess I'll do it. But if I want somebody to come on and disciple students, then it's biblically my responsibility to know who I'm bringing on board. And so when you cast that vision, God will send you the right people. The whole passage about the harvest is plentiful, but the labors are few. So our duty is not to complain that the labors are few. Our duty is to pray so that God will send more laborers, and we know that we serve a faithful God. So if you're doing what He's called you to do, He's going to send laborers. It might not be who you expected, but if you're really putting it up front about what we're all about, then that's going to weed a lot of people out right off the bat. If you are like, no, this is what we're all about, it's a great way to kind of make sure that the people who are joining are in for the right reasons and not coming with their own agendas or priorities.
Well, and I think even how we recruit makes a huge difference too of who's like raising their hand for that. Like, so I found that if you have that bold vision, like we've talked about in the previous episode, like where if you have a clear, like way that you're heading towards ministry, you're not just filling spots.
Yeah.
Like you're like, listen, we're called to do this.
Yes.
Will you join us?
Yes.
Like that is a big difference than just like, hey, so-and-so moved away, so can you fill in for them? It's like, and it just seems like a warm body position. And so you want to make sure that's like you're presenting it as like, hey, this is where we're seeing transformed lives, for the gospel, or like with the gospel of Jesus, like, will you join in with us to make this more possible? And I found that recruiting towards that, and people will come out of the woodwork for a bold vision. Like they'll come out of the woodwork when you know that you have a clear way that they can serve and make a difference. Another thing is a lot of times good, like solid leaders will run in packs.
Yeah.
So it's like, the best way to sometimes recruit other leaders is to ask your current leaders, okay, who are your friends? Like who are you running? Like I ask them, they know what's involved to be in your youth ministry, so they can in turn, even recruit for you, to even like know, hey, like I think they would be a good fit. So, but just even asking that question sometimes puts that on the radar to watch out for people. And we've seen many leaders that have gotten involved through another leader that they knew that just wasn't involved yet. Another thing is that you just mentioned is vetting is more important than like almost anything. Like make sure that they're not just passing a background check and have a pulse. Like that's obviously, and sometimes like it's not even a background check. Which if you don't have that set up in your youth ministry, like have background checks, safety, of course. But sometimes we just do that. It's like, oh, they pass a background check, and it's like, no, like you have to feel called to youth ministry to really be effective long term. And we've been really privileged. I think you would say the same about your youth ministry, that you have stellar leaders that like really make the core of your ministry like even better because they're on board with what you're doing. Like they love the Lord. They're examples for students. And so with that, what I found is appealing to the masses doesn't always work. Like in other words, making an announcement to the whole church doesn't always bring people out. The real leaders, sometimes you have to have a personal invitation for them, where you put your hand on the shoulder and say, hey, I've been really thinking that you would be a good fit for this. Do you want to come out and sit in with one of our groups, or to come serve for a night or whatever, to see what it's like. I think an underutilized group too is parents. We were talking about this before too, of really focusing on stellar parents. Now we also want to be cautious because you don't want the parents of teenagers to feel, or I'm sorry, the teenagers of those parents to feel like they can't share openly in the group. So what we have is we have parents that serve, and we're trying to recruit even more parents of teenagers in our own ministry, but ones that that don't serve directly in their kids group, or with their so if we have a mom of a teenage boy, like she can obviously serve with other teenage girls, like with middle school or high school or whatever. And we do that because one, and I'm a firm believer this, like no one loves your kid more than you, like and so like no one loves teenagers more than parents of teenagers. Like we want to love them, we want to care for them, but there's like some kind of like primal instinct like that really, really comes out with parents, like really wanting to invest in the next generation because they have teenagers of their own. They want to invest in their friends, like they want to, so to even have that aspect of leaders. Now, what are some barriers that can prohibit having stellar leaders within your youth ministry?
Where do I start? Because there's I think understanding what they're being called to. So we don't want to. We can never call people to something and then all of a sudden raise the standard of what we're calling them to. So we need to be clear up front with what we're calling them to. C.T. Studd says people full of the Holy Spirit are committed to God's work. They want to be where laborers are needed most. And there's no more pressing need than bringing the gospel to hell-bound men and women. And that's Robert Coleman, who wrote the book Master Plan of Evangelism. And so if a huge barrier is if we make the barrier to entry so insignificant and so easy and simple that when we try to raise it, there's going to be pushback because it's not what they agreed to. So we tell our people it's kind of like the gospel. When you're in, there's no getting out, right? I mean, obviously life situations happen.
Like you have to sign this with blood.
But yeah, I mean, we're very clear about what we're calling people to. We don't want them to feel like, well, why don't you just, maybe whatever you can serve, we'll take you. Now, there are times where obviously we want to be mindful of that, but we're very clear. It's like, no, this is what we expect from our leaders, and being clear about that. I think the other thing is being clear about who we're looking for. Luke 6:40 says that everyone who's fully trained will be like their master. So I ask myself every question. The question for every leader is, if my son grew up and looked just like their small group leader, would I be okay with that? Would I be happy with that? And I can thankfully say everybody in our ministry right now, yes, I'd be thrilled if my son or daughter grew up to look like them. So I think making clear what they would be, volunteering for, making sure that we're putting them in a position to succeed, because if we're setting somebody up who is not, what we feel God is looking for, then we're setting that person up to fail, and the students are going to be worse off because of that. But I think a big one is, we've talked about before, the will skill quadrant, where in church we are famous for taking the person who has the knowledge and knows how to speak the language and say, let's just get this person with students and it'll be great. But they don't have the desire. That's not their gifting. That's not where they want to be. Maybe they just don't even have the motivation. But if we can take the person who has high will, who wants to do it, we can resource them and train them and equip them all day long.
Is a huge, to have the humility from a leader to be teachable, is a huge thing.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I've learned, I got this from my friend Bill, that there's kind of like a trifecta of ministry, that effective ministry happens when there's clear expectations, like you mentioned, clear accountability to those expectations. So it's like, okay, we want everybody to arrive 15 minutes, before programming to have our meeting, whatever, our leaders meeting, so that we can care for the students better. Well, there's one thing to set that expectation, but then when no one shows up, to not address it, to not say hey, where were you? We were counting on you to be there, or, and so the accountability to those expectations. And then, of course, the relational involvement of those leaders. So you want to be caring for and shepherding those leaders just like you would students. You want to be the shepherd of leaders, so that they're in turn shepherding students. And so with that, sometimes when we have expectation and accountability without the relational involvement, we come across as dictators, right? Where we're only asking them about things that they're doing rather than asking how they're doing. And there's a big difference, right? Because we don't want to be the taskmaster, of our leaders, just, asking them okay, did you do this? Did you do this? And really not checking in. It's hey, how are your parents doing? You mentioned that they were moving across the country or somewhere. How did that exam go that you were, if you have a college student or whatever. So to ask them personal things about their lives, to care for them in such a way that they know that you're caring for them, and they're not just there to complete a task or to to serve in such a way. So when you have one or more of those things not there, it's evident. So if you have expectation and relational involvement, but you don't have the accountability, then people feel like they can just do whatever. If you have the expectation and accountability, but no relational involvement, again, dictatorship. And if you have the expectation and relational involvement but no accountability, you can have they're just walking all over you. And then if you have the accountability with the relational involvement with no expectation, they're really frustrated because they don't know what you want from them, but you're holding them accountable to it.
Yeah.
But and then they're just well, you didn't tell me that I need to be here 15 minutes before or whatever.
Yeah.
And so the reality is that when all three of those are working together, it really helps to solidify that bond, and they can trust you more.
Yeah.
Now, when it comes to recruiting specific leaders, we mentioned about asking current leaders to reach out to people that they know. Do you guys have a method of recruiting leaders, or is it mainly just through word of mouth? Is it do you open up certain roles for more people in the church? Do you have you guard a certain level of leaders, for certain for certain roles in your youth ministry? Tell me about that. What does it look like for your ministry?
Yeah, we probably do things a little bit differently, because there's a lot of different experiences that go into that. So I've never once made an announcement saying we're looking for youth volunteers. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing.
That's a horrible thing.
To me, I just hate having that conversation with somebody who I'm oh man, I can't. This isn't going to be a good fit. It's not going to be a good fit. So I've never once made an announcement. I've never once made a PowerPoint slide or anything advertising. To me, it's all about, hey, praying every single time, even when we have all the volunteers, God, who's the next couple, who's the next person? And we also do things differently too. We require couples to serve together. And that kind of helps too when one spouse says, hey, I'm all in, and but they don't have a biblical marriage that's being modeled. It's not that we want to count that against them, but it's simply we think it's important that kids see biblical marriages. Mm-hmm. So, if you're single, obviously we don't hold that against you, but we require couples to serve together for that purpose, for that reason. So it's mostly word of mouth, mostly, like I said, me kind of just praying and watching. But really, once we approach that person, we feel strongly that, if we get the right people to see what God is doing, then they're going to want to be in. Because how can you get in a room filled with teens who are praying for lost friends and sharing the gospel and not want to be a part of that? Mm-hmm. And so are we creating an environment that people want to be a part of? And so we come and they visit. And then once they do, then we have a sit down conversation where we ask some difficult questions. What does your walk with Christ look like? When was the last time you shared the gospel? Yeah. What is your how do you see the Great Commission playing out in your life? Mm-hmm. Is there any sin patterns that you might be struggling with that might be a stumbling block for students? Questions that are uncomfortable asking, but I'd much rather ask on the front side than find out later. Yeah. And so once they've kind of gone through that, then we have an onboarding process where we have some resources and a book that we ask them to read and a study that we ask them to do to kind of get them caught up to speed. Mm-hmm. But we try and allow them to shadow leaders as much as possible. We've all been there where you just get thrown into a group that you don't know and you're like, all right, let's teach the gospel and we get to know you. So we try and bring leaders along. Even when we're fully staffed, we always try and have that next person who's shadowing and partnering with somebody else. Then we can launch them. And that's a luxury to have, to be in that place, because a lot of leaders, probably most youth leaders, are not there yet. But I promise that if you pray and you ask for laborers, God will take care of that, because we serve a promise-keeping God. Yeah.
And one of the things that we do, in our ministry is like the, kind of our volunteer process. So like if someone shows interest, or if we are trying to recruit someone in, we'll have them obviously pass a background check. Like I don't even want people around students if they
can't even shadow or visit.
Yeah. And sometimes, and of course, like that's sometimes a formality, because it's like, okay, whatever. Like especially in this area in Northern Virginia, we have a lot of government people that already have like way more secure clearance than I do. So it's it's not a big deal. But what that does is it almost weeds out people that are like, that could be predatory. It's like if they're opposed to getting a background check, that should be a huge red flag. So do that, of course. And then what I have them do is I have them come visit ministry. Mm-hmm. And sometimes like they come visit and they're like, this is not for me. Yeah. And that's okay. Like I'd rather them know right now. Yeah. Instead of going through that whole process and then having them come visit and it's like, oh yeah, like I don't feel comfortable doing this. It's like, okay, we just wasted a lot of time like getting to this point. So usually that's like the second thing. Mm-hmm. And then if they're like, yeah, like I can see, I share with them like our vision, like and what we're all about. And then from there it's like then kind of like application interview. So like we have a kind of a standardized application to serve with Next Generation at our church. And then from there, I do the interview. That's what I'm usually asking. It's like, tell me about your quiet time lately. Like, tell me about a verse that you memorized recently. Tell me about the last time you shared the gospel. Like, what did that look like? And if they're like on all those questions, like that's a red flag, because you want them to be exemplary for your students that you're asking to do those things. Mm-hmm. And we want to get to the point, of course, like we're trying to model this like in our own walks with the Lord, but this has always been a convicting passage of scripture for me. 1 Corinthians 11:1 says, follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. And that is like really challenging when you're like, hey, we want to follow Christ, like that's our ultimate goal, but just follow my example as I follow Christ. Like just look to me as a person example of that. And to say that, like, for a volunteer, like to do that, like, are you worthy of following? That is a huge question that can reveal a lot of, it's like, and if they're like questioning, like, I don't think I'm worthy of it, it's like, then you might not want to put them in a position where they're discipling teenagers. Mm-hmm. So we have our ministry divided out into different levels of commitment. Mm-hmm. So we have like quarterly or like annual volunteers. So we might have like an annual event where we just need a lot more people. Like we need security, or we need people to help drive, or like, there's still requirements for that, but it's not like a regular weekly investment in teenagers. I would definitely look at that position, in serving in ministry a lot differently than the weekly involvement of teenagers. Yeah. And then we have like quarterly or even sometimes monthly involvement where it's like, okay, we need people to rotate through making food for our gatherings. Like, okay, so do they need to have like the qualifications of an elder to to do that? No, not necessarily. Like we want to make sure that they're vetted, and but they don't need to like be at that level to where the highest priority for us is people that are regularly investing in the teenagers on a week-to-week basis, which we do the most vetting for. And then through that, we even give first priority to our leaders to go to camp. Like, so in other words, our leaders are the ones that are going to camp. Sometimes we have people that come out of the woodwork and say, hey, I want to serve at camp. It's like, well, we give them first priority. Like, if we can't, if some of our leaders have scheduling conflicts, then we can fill in the different positions. But for the most part, we have consistent leadership, throughout all of our, heavy investing, opportunities for students. Another thing, when it comes to, setting up just quality leadership within, our thing is the ongoing accountability for your leaders. So what does that look like for you? Like, how do you do that? Like, how do you continuously care for them? How do you continuously, because it's like one thing to just to vet in the beginning, but as like there could be mission drift. There could be like people that just don't do the things that they said that they were doing before. And so how do you consistently keep that at the foreground, of your leaders?
Yeah. Well, the first thing is meeting with them outside of youth group. And the cool part is with our volunteer team, whenever we get together, it doesn't feel like a meeting. I mean, it just feels like we're getting together and we're discussing ministry, but it's kind of just our friend group now, because if you serve alongside of them, naturally you're gonna build friendships. So I want to meet with them outside of just youth group, and I'm not great at this. I'm really not great at this, and this is something I'm working at being better at. But meeting with them on a regular basis, individually and as a group, and just kind of saying like, hey, how's it going? Because we don't want them to just feel like, hey, even though they're a solid biblical believer, we don't want them just to feel like we're only spending time with them because of what we can get out of them. We want them to know that, hey, your ministry is your testimony. And so, if our testimony starts to fail, then our ministry is going to follow. And so investing in them, but also helping them to see, us as a place that can help them grow in their faith. And so, we resource them. I challenge them, hey, we're all going to read this book. We've got enough time to read it, but let's all read it, and then we're going to get together and we're going to talk about it. How does this apply to our youth ministry? What does this look like? We're going to bring in people to train, or, hey, I want you guys to watch this video. And so now it doesn't feel like assigned work, because I'm growing through it and I'm getting something out of it. And so now they kind of view it as, and that's one of the biggest things that I've found is when we're challenging leaders, they're growing, and now they feel valuable, but they also feel like they're getting value out of it because they're growing themselves. So I think doing that. And then lastly is, are you praying for your leaders? I pray for the leaders every day, for their marriages, for their families, for their ministries, and for their testimonies. And, pray for them, because we don't want to take them for granted to say, okay, great, we've got solid leaders. Dan Spader in his book, 4-Chair Discipling, he talks about Jesus keeping the healthy healthy. He's a doctor. He came for the sick, and that's what we want to do. But in order to do that, we ourselves must be healthy in order to care for the sick. And so if we're neglecting keeping the healthy, and we're just focusing on those that need care, well, then at some point that person's going to need care as well. And so just making sure that we don't see them as a volunteer, we see them as a person that God has entrusted us to lead them well. And just for them to help hold us accountable too. We don't want to be above that. We want them to feel like, hey, just like I'm holding you accountable, I want you to hold me accountable. I'm not above, I am one of our leaders. I'm have the privilege of being here and I'm doing this full time, but I'm one of our leaders when it comes down to youth group. Yeah,
definitely. Well, and occasionally this happens, but we obviously don't want it to. But when you have a leader that just has kind of gone off the deep end, so to speak, of like they've made some poor decisions that where they're not really qualified to lead a group of people anymore. And I've had this happen several times. And again, the biggest benefit to that scenario, as far as like that conversation or, like walking a leader through a disciplinary process of stepping down is very difficult. But one of the biggest things that I could do to kind of prevent that or to help that is, again, those clear expectations. One of the things that we've done in our ministry in the past is have the leaders like literally annually signed an agreement, like understanding what it means to be a leader, like to be more example, and sometimes even be held to a higher example than just like a regular Christian out there, like just because you're in the spotlight more as students are looking up to you. And so has there been a time in your ministry, I didn't even ask this to you before, but like has there been a time where you've had to ask a leader to step down because of poor decisions that they've made?
Thankfully, not yet.
Okay. Yeah.
So I'm very, very thankful for that.
Yeah. Well, and there's been several times, I've been in ministry a little bit longer than you, maybe a couple of years. Like by 15 years or something.
You've got me beat quite a bit.
So with that, there's been several times where we've had to have those conversations, and I'd say it's less difficult when you've been clear up front about the expectation, because then it's not a matter of like revealing that this is a bad thing. It's a hey, you know that this was something that would disqualify you from serving, and then, but it really helps to understand, because it's really difficult conversation. It's a crucial conversation that you need to navigate through with a lot of grace and a lot of patience. But when it comes down to it, of course, every scenario can be different. But to help them, to help yourself see that like you're not the bad guy for holding people accountable, right? You're not the one that made the poor decision, or like that got into a sin pattern or whatever like that. But you're actually helping them and caring them for them. If you have that position of like, this is the best thing for you to really step down so you can focus on getting healthy before you step back into a leadership role. And of course that depends on what it was and like how, and so sometimes there's disqualification that comes from where they can't serve anymore, like in this context. And sometimes it's a way that you can, restore them back to health before they serve again, and had those conversations before. But I think in any of those, to really walk through with lots of prayer, lots of grace, involve other people, trusted people, like in leadership at your church. But that shouldn't be the case for a lot of your leaders, because you want them to lead by example in the first place. So hopefully you vetted them enough to where those aren't frequent conversations, and you vetted them enough to where they understand the expectations, to where they would even come to you. I've even had that too, where I've had leaders come to me and say, hey, I agreed that I would live at this level of standard, and I haven't upheld that, so I'm withdrawing myself from ministry. So it's not like a thing where you're having to tell them, which makes it a lot easier because you've already set that example, and that's the standard that you've set. So with that, what are some things that you would summarize for us today about leaders leading by example? We talked about Paul even saying like, "Follow me as I follow Christ." We want to model that for our own selves, like that we're modeling it for our students and leaders. But what are some other summaries that you would take away from today?
Yeah, I think the biggest one being understanding that your students are going to eventually, hopefully, look like your leaders. And so understanding that if our job is to train them up into, biblical, disciplines, our leaders must be doing that first and foremost. I think secondly, is understanding that, we never want to pursue leaders out of simply need. We want to pursue them out of, expansive ministry, not just to staff what we are doing, but to be able to take the ministry where God has called us to. And then lastly, I think it's a lesson for us to understand that we can't be above accountability. When we bring leaders on, we must see that as a group that can hold us accountable and make sure that we don't drift from the vision that God has given us in the first place.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your time today on this episode as we've covered leaders leading by example. I want to remind you guys that you can go to edgeclub.org and download the free training manual on how to start an Edge Club or a campus ministry in public schools near you. And I would love for you to like and share and comment. Share this with other people that you think would be benefit. If you've received value from that, we always appreciate your feedback. So if there's a certain topic that you'd like to cover, we'd love to know. So please leave that in the comments below, or you can send us an email, keith@edgeclub.org. So we'll see you guys next time.